Hi, everyone. I'm Rosemarie Miller here with Brett House, a professor of economics at Columbia Business School, here to tell us about the global economic impacts of the Israel-Hamas war. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's good to speak with you at this very difficult time.
Absolutely. So, Brett, what measures and precautions are being taken by financial analysts and organizations to prepare for the economic consequences of this conflict?
Well, I think the biggest thing they're trying to prepare for is the uncertainty that this could conflagrate into a much bigger conflict, affecting a bigger and wider region than is currently the case, with implications for international commodity markets, uh, fixed income markets, and equity markets. And so, on any desk that's trying to manage risk, they're going to be looking at potentially hedging some of their existing positions, moving into some further protection through things like credit default swaps, and as well moving into safer or safe haven type assets like the US dollar and currency markets, US treasuries, and other really blue chip or AAA rated credit instruments.
So let's talk about oil a little bit. How does the conflict between Israel and Hamas historically relate to oil prices and their impact on the global economy?
Well, typically in the past, whenever we've seen conflict in the Middle East, we've seen an almost immediate spike in oil prices as markets have moved to anticipate what could be a cutoff or an interruption in supply from the region. It's worth noting, though, that so long as this conflict remains very localized between Israel and Gaza, the impact directly on supplies should be almost nil. Neither are major producers of oil, natural gas, or other commodities, and neither sit in the way of major supply lines or shipping lines. But with the prospect that the conflict could widen across the region, the traditional move by markets is to take cover immediately and ask questions later. And the possibility that oil prices and gas prices will back up further is really a reflection of the fear that this conflict could start affecting more countries, pull in more combatants, and affect more regions where commodities do flow.
Well, while we're talking about history, could you give us some historical precedents that demonstrate the potential for regional conflicts to expand?
Well, the most immediate precedent is the Russia Ukraine war, which, of course, in many ways began in 2014 with the illegal Russian takeover of Crimea. And has not expanded outside of the region, but has expanded in terms of length and in terms of impact, as we've seen a huge effect on wheat prices, sunflower prices, other food commodities that Ukraine is a major exporter of. And that's had a big impact, not just on grocery store prices here in the United States, but particularly in low income and developing countries where major sources of their staple products have been cut off or constrained and prices have gone up precipitously.
Hmm. So, the Center on Global Energy Policy notes that the world has become more efficient in using oil. Can you explain how this increased efficiency has changed the dynamics of oil's impact on the global economy?
Well, what they mean by increased efficiency is that for every real dollar of GDP or gross national output that we create, it requires a smaller and smaller amount of oil to produce each of those units of output. If you chart over the last 5 decades since the oil crises in the 1970s, our moves to increase efficiency and find alternative fuel sources have meant that we produce more and more output, pretty much 5 times as much output for every drop of oil than we did in the past. And that means the impact and the implications of a big spike in oil prices is smaller than it would have been previously, not just in terms of the implications for economic growth, but also for inflation and interest rates.
Hmm. And you touched on this earlier when you were speaking about keeping it localized if that happens. Well, if the conflict remains localized, how soon could oil prices stabilize and what might be the expected impact on global economic growth and inflation?
Well, for the moment, I think the impact on growth and inflation is minimal. And what we really have to look at is how long and drawn out the conflict is and what other regional actors respond to it with, whether they begin putting sanctions on other countries, whether they become involved in the conflict themselves. And so prices are likely to remain elevated until we get some sign on what the rest of the region is going to do. And initially, those signs aren't great. With the cancellation of the summit with President Biden and greater outrage growing in the region at some of the events that have taken place in Gaza, it is difficult to see an immediate resolution that would satisfy markets and provide a clear signal that supply lines will remain clearly open and that these sort of preemptive moves in prices are unwarranted.
So, what are the key factors and indicators that experts are monitoring to assess the likelihood of such an escalation?
Well, I think it is those communications from regional leaders, the potential involvement of not just the United States, but other large global powers such as Russia, and the extent to which we see progress in bringing tensions down directly in the region itself. At the same time, we'll be continuing to look at how financial flows are altered by the conflict and how major sources of money are formulating their hedging positions. And that will give some indication on what smart money is doing, even before we have a clear indication from political leaders.
So let's talk about Saudi Arabia a little bit. So, given the role of Saudi Arabia as a major oil exporter, how might it balance its interest in keeping oil prices at the right level, and what pressures might it face from other global actors in this context?
Well, of course, it's curious to ask what the right level is. The right level for a consuming country is not the right level for a producing country. Saudi Arabia obviously has an interest in keeping prices elevated, but it also has an interest in keeping them relatively stable because big swings in oil prices induce further efficiency gains, as do high prices over time. And so it is a balancing act that it has to square with its political considerations in the region. And some of those imperatives directly involve Iran. As the two major powers in the region, both oil exporters, but with a history of being at odds with one another, they are not clearly aligned on ensuring that oil supply and demand are balanced in a way that keeps prices positive for them, but relatively stable.
Well, let's discuss the worst possible case scenario that things escalate into a world war, which could have catastrophic impacts on the economic market. So, what are the key geopolitical elements that could lead to such a scenario, and what preventative measures are being discussed to avoid it?
Well, the real issue that hangs in the balance now is the extent to which neighboring countries to Israel or other strong regional countries will become involved in this conflict or seek to de escalate. And a further conflagration that moves from a regional conflict into a global conflict is one where speaking about the economic impact becomes really beside the point because the human impact, the social impact, the political impact, the impact on all of our daily lives would be so extreme that in some ways what happens to prices and markets will be secondary.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Brett.
It's great to speak.